what I want you to do is just do a little brainstorm for yourself. We're going to be talking a lot about plants, and we're going to talk about how plants are useful, which goes back to something we talked about way back in September when we were learning about plants. And so what I want you to do is just in the chat, just type out as many different uses that we use for plants of various kinds, right? Just as a way to get your brain warmed up. Any that you can think of. Okay, ready, set, go. Every single use for plants. All right. Uses for plants. Food. Yes, definitely, of course. Oxygen. Yeah, so critical for our planet, right? Without plants, we don't have oxygen. And of course, food as well, energy. Most of our energy comes from the sun, and plants are the ones that get it first. We got medicine, definitely. You can trace most medicines back to a plant. Building materials. Holding soil together. Yeah, so good point. Plants also are really critical just in ecosystems and being able to, hold the soil together, prevent against erosion, and kind of hold natural landscapes together. Use them for clothes. Yes, that's one thing we'll talk about is fibers in plants. And I also see they give our peers a rash. Yes, I suppose if you were to roll around in some poison ivy or something you're allergic to, not the most useful use of a plant, but probably some of those same things that would make a plant give you a rash are chemicals that we study that we can then end up using for other purposes. So some like pesticides, for example, are based from plants because they're irritants or something like that to a particular creature, and so we can take them from a plant and we can use them as like a pesticide. Peppers are a really good example of something that we as humans we like, but really the reason peppers are spicy is to try to deter things from eating them. So you could like grind up peppers and put them along your garden if you have like cats or rodents that come around. You can use them as a deterrent. What else we got here? Decoration, yes, and aesthetic as well, right? Like you think about flowers and the aesthetic that they give us and just sort of the beauty of living things. Recreational stuff, yeah, teas, essential oils, spiritual practice, definitely. Yeah, and then there's like recreational like substances, right? Like cannabis as well that kind of fit into that. That are a little bit more uses with some more issues for sure. But yeah, essential oils. Yeah, people like will burn sage because of the smoke it creates. So plants, of course, are like darn critical. We're going to talk today specifically about kind of the building materials and the structural features of plants, and we're going to connect them to connect them back to some of the things we've been talking about. So some of those structural components and forces and those kinds of things. And then we're going to talk about how we can use those to make building materials and like a little bit about maybe some traditional ways of creating things using plants. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just my little tray, of plants that I've started here. Probably the best way. Probably can't see them well if I do this. So what I'm going to do is use this camera here. All right, here we go. So you can see this little tray of plants. They're pretty small. I'm going to hold them up to the camera. And I want you to kind of look at them and just pay attention to how they're able to keep themselves standing and just some of the details of these little structures. Now, these are all still pretty small. These are some little baby kales, which are quite yummy. Some pak choi, some lettuce. But if you pay attention specifically to these little guys, my camera's not amazing. You can even start to see some of those structures we've been talking about that humans make use of, right? Like the main stalk of these plants is sort of like a column, right? It has very much a column kind of idea to it, and it needs to be under compression. And then if you like look at each of these leaves needs to kind of stick out to one side and kind of cantilever out to one side, right? There's nothing to support them other than going right back to the stalk. And so what you'll notice is that at the center of every leaf or every branch is sort of a thicker stem or a thicker stalk. And it kind of works almost like a beam would work, right? It allows you to sort of carry a load across or out away from the main trunk of that plant. You see those same structures if you look at a tree as well. So you'll see, the main trunk is a column to support all the load, and then each branch sort of serves like a beam. And what you might also notice is some of these sort of triangular structures, right? That a lot of branches on plants, they grow at sort of an angle to the stalk, and that allows them to use some of the sort of benefits of triangles. And again, this is just something that plants have sort of stumbled upon, right? It's just kind of in their nature to grow this way. But so we can already start to just see some of those components that we would have talked about last week. So that kind of connects us to where we were last. And then what we're going to look at today specifically is we're going to look at kind of closer into the parts of some plants and the building materials that make them. So I'm just going to set this back for a second. And we're going to look at some of these are old dried pieces of plants from last year. This is actually a corn stalk. And it's you know, even though we were looking at these small little seedlings down here, we were already starting to notice some of these structural details, right? Like columns and so on. But then of course, in a much more mature plant, you can see much better how that is, right? And so with this corn stalk, you can see it's very similar to bamboo. It actually uses kind of a shell-like structure. So if I kind of break it apart, you can see when I open it up to the inside, I don't know if there's a way for me, and this isn't the best, I'm experimenting here. You can see that like a lot of the strength, maybe you can't see this well, a lot of the strength is on the outside of this structure. And then when I start to pull this apart, you know, what you start to notice is that it's made of these fibers, right? So they're these long strands, these long strings that make this up, and they all sort of just stack together to give this plant its structure. And so you can think back to a very long time ago when humans were first starting to figure out how to build structures. Plants were sort of the first inspiration for that, right? You could use stalks like this to construct things. And you could also take the fibers out of these plants and you could use them to create things as well, right? So you could weave fibers of plants together, and you can make clothing or other kinds of items. But I'm seeing a question here about trees and how, you know, they don't fall over because they're attached to the ground. And definitely there's some structural forces involved here, right? What we can't see, of course, is when we look underneath the tree, you're going to see, you know, a bunch of roots that would come out from under this tree, and they're going underground, and they require a certain amount of basically force, right? Like there's almost like a levering effect. Like if you imagined taking the top of this tree and kind of like sort of pulling on the top of that tree, it's not going to tip over because it's got something to resist it in the ground. Now, if the roots of that tree weren't very sturdy, then it's very possible that you could produce enough force to almost like pry it out of the ground, right? So there's definitely, it's the same kind of idea. It's about structures and forces, but you're absolutely right that this tree probably wouldn't stand on its own if we just cut it off at the trunk and sat it on the ground. It requires that sort of foundation, right? And it kind of goes into the idea of how like mass structures work. It's why we build buildings with concrete foundations, is because if you kind of have enough mass or enough resistance at the bottom of a structure, it's very difficult to topple it over. And so that's kind of what the roots are doing. They're sort of grabbing onto the dirt and grabbing all that mass under the ground, so that to topple the structure, you'd have to move all that mass of dirt as well. That's a good question, and it's an interesting interpretation and a way to think about kind of the structures that we see, you know, created in nature, and then how we as humans have kind of mimicked that a little bit as we build our structures. Cool. So I want to just show you, as we're talking about kind of the way that these things become sturdy, I want to show you just some more examples. Not this one here. We'll take this here. So these are willow branches, and willow branches are quite unique because they're quite sturdy and they're also very flexible. And so willow branches can be bent, and they can essentially be woven as well. And so a lot of times people will use willow branches to like weave fences. You can use willow branches to make like lattices and trellises that other plants might climb. But you can also take a willow branch and you can sort of split it, and you can extract a large amount of fiber from it as well. It kind of works like a rope. Okay, I've got it started here now. So what you'll notice is I can essentially peel this thing, and I can extract a very long, and there it kind of broke it, but I can extract a very long fiber from this plant. And this is like kind of like a rope, right? It has a certain amount of tensile strength to it. and it's fairly sturdy. I can break it with my hand if I were to pull hard enough. But if I were to take a bunch of fibers like this and braid them together, I could make an even stronger string or an even stronger rope. And this is a way that people would have traditionally, indigenous people, for example, would have made ropes and other materials. Right now we use synthetic plastic-like materials, but you can make ropes by just basically peeling fibers off of plants, weaving them together, and you get these long tensile structures. So it's kind of cool. It's something you might consider doing if you're bored. Just go in your backyard. Don't destroy a plant that you don't have permission to destroy, or that you can't pull a few branches off without hurting it. But if you have a plant that, like this one, like I just pruned it, then you could take those branches, you could extract some of these fibers, and you can do braiding stuff with this, and you can like make ropes and stuff. And it's kind of a nice Zen fun activity if you're feeling bored. And I'm going to show that we'll use this for something else in just a moment here. So the other thing that we're going to look at, I'm going to just put my seedlings over in the shade here. They're not quite ready for the difficulties of being in completely outside right now. So the other thing I want to show you then, so we were talking about these fibers. But another thing that we'll use plants for is really just as rods and poles. And here's a really good example. This is bamboo, and here's an example of kind of like a shell structure, right? Bamboo gets all of its strength from this sort of outside. Now, this piece of bamboo's got a split down it, which actually compromises its strength a little. It's not going to be as strong. But one that does not have a split, actually most of these do because they're getting old, but when they don't, they're like particularly sturdy. And then one thing that, these are just harvested right from bamboo plants, which are a species of grass. And so there's a reason why they look, pretty similar to a corn stalk, right? They have these like little nodes where there used to be leaves growing on these plants. They look very similar because they're part of sort of that same family of plants, but bamboo is much stronger than that corn stalk is. And so then what you can do is you can take pieces of bamboo and you can lash them together. So using a string or a fiber from another plant, you can essentially go and wrap around the joint of these two components, right? So we're making a joint right now. And what I'm going to do when I lash is I'm basically just crisscrossing back and forth over and over and over again around this until I run out of string. And then at the end, I'm going to take this and I'm just going to tie it off. Sorry, my camera work's probably very shoddy, but I'm trying my best here. So there, that's not a very good lash, but you can see kind of the idea here is that creates a joint between these two materials, and now they'll rotate, but they won't really separate. And so if you were to take 3 pieces of bamboo and lash them together in a triangle, for example, and you were to lash them tightly, then suddenly you'd have basically the beginning of a truss. You'd have a very sturdy structure to begin with. And this is a way that a lot of traditional people would have made structures, both for growing and cultivating things, but also for living in, right? Teepees are essentially made of multiple poles that are lashed together all at the top. This is the kind of technique that would have been used to create bowstrings and sort of attach bowstrings to bows through different plant fibers and so on. So again, although plants sort of seem simple and primitive in a lot of ways, they've got these structures within them that are certainly as advanced as the techniques that humans have discovered. And I think it's probably not good to underestimate how much value comes from still kind of using plants in traditional ways like this. I know a lot of people who garden using things like bamboo, and that's what they do. They lash them together. They make structures out of them. You can make all kinds of things. You can make like gazebos, you can make lawn chairs. And as you would have seen today in the video, you can also make entire houses out of bamboo. So there's a lot of use for these plants that ties in with structures. Grace says, yes, a life lesson, corn is not a reliable building material. It depends what you're going to build though, right? Like these stalks, surprisingly enough, right? These I pulled out of the garden just a week ago. I just left them all winter, and they stayed standing all winter as, a rigid structure. And so in terms of how much weight they had to carry from snow loads and stuff like that, they it stayed standing a shockingly long time. So, you know, in a pinch, if you really needed to make a little hut or something, you could probably make it out of corn. It just just don't expect it to last very long. Some of these things like bamboo, though, like I've had this bamboo for probably 3 or 4 years, you know, in all kinds of elements. I just leave it outside, and it stays pretty rigid and sturdy throughout all of that. And these joints, you know, that's not the tightest joint, but look at me try to pull this apart. I just barely can, right? So although these plants look sort of weak at first when you look at them, when they're used the right way, right? So when you use the parts that are fibrous, when you use those in tension, and when you use the parts under compression, if you use those parts correctly, then you can build some pretty darn strong stuff. I apologize for my bad camera work. Again, I'm just trying something new here. Okay, I'm going to show you one last thing, and this is something, again, that you could apply for yourself. Beans. Think back to there's the fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk or something. Like, so from a very young age, you're probably well aware that beans are climbing plants, right? They vine up and they climb up things. So a really common technique that people will use to grow beans is to grow them up a trellis. They like to wind up things as they grow when you're growing beans. And so a common design that people will use is 3 or 4 bamboo poles or more, all kind of lashed together to make a structure. And so I'll show you what that might look like. So here is just a simple structure. It's made with 4 pieces of bamboo, and they've just been lashed together at the top. And the idea here is that you could then plant beans at the bottoms, the four kind of places where those posts go into the soil. You could plant 2 or 3 bean plants at each one. And as they grow right up that structure. They wind themselves up those poles. And eventually this thing fills in like this big lush green pyramid, and it ends up being full of beans that you can pick in the summer. You can also grow tomatoes this way, grow a tomato at each corner, and then as the tomatoes grow up, you sort of tie them to the bamboo. And basically this just allows you to grow plants more strategically and creating a structure. This structure is tremendously strong. When you're growing a bunch of beans, when you consider in the middle of summer, it often has like multiple pounds of beans hanging off of it, right? It's got a lot of load to carry, and so this is a very strong structure. Put quite a bit of weight on that. I'm, like leaning with a good amount of my own weight on this, and this is not going anywhere. Very similar design to First Nations people, right? Blackfeet people that would have made teepees. Of course, they would have used pines stripped of their branches, really long poles, and they would have used more of them. But same kind of structure. This is used as triangular structures. It's a very, very sturdy shape. And it can support a lot of weight. So this would be a type of technology, a type of structure that humans would have known about for a very long time, maybe going back 50,000, 100,000 years perhaps, would have been some of the earliest technology that humans would have started to discover, is basically how to make use of plants and use those plants to sort of kind of coexist and create things and grow things, that kind of thing. Can you grow pumpkins, Liv? Yeah, so I've heard of people who do grow pumpkins this way, but only, I've never tried it, and only some varieties of them. So you have to grow a fairly small kind, like those little decorative pumpkins you could probably grow this way. You'd have to be sensitive and to sort of trellising up kind of training the pumpkin up the trellis, right, as it grows. And then I've heard that sometimes when it actually starts to grow pumpkins, you have to support those pumpkins. So you might have to I've heard people use they'll just use an old t-shirt or old piece of cloth, and they'll use it to kind of hold up the pumpkin, and they'll tie it to one of the posts. Another thing that you can take this structure and you can modify it by adding ladder steps to it, which will allow it to grow pumpkins probably better. And so what you do is just take shorter pieces of bamboo and lash them, at different heights up this on all 4 sides. And that would create kind of like a ladder effect. And apparently that's a very common way to grow cucumbers, is in a trellis structure like that. And I'm sure that would work really well for small pumpkins too. Yeah, this summer I'm actually going to try this with one type of squash anyway and see how it goes. It's one of those things where if you had a lot of land, it's not really that essential. These plants grow on the ground just fine. But if you're, like me, I've got a limited amount of gardening space here that we want to grow as much as we can in. And so under those circumstances, it makes a lot of sense to try to train things vertically and use the vertical space in your garden. Well, thanks for joining me on this unique new way of doing science here, but I thought it would be a good way to apply what you've been learning this week. All right, well, with that, I'm going to wrap up here today. Just in summary, plants are a huge inspiration for humans in understanding structures. They're essential to our life, and sort of learning from them and working with them in some of these kind of traditional ways is it's a really good way to both learn and also appreciate our place on this planet. And so thank you for joining me here today in my backyard, and have a lovely rest of the day. See ya.